What if the most devastating royal move of the decade didn't come with a headline, a decree, or even a denial, but with silence? No warning, no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet shift that left one woman elevated and another suddenly irrelevant. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because here's the question no one is asking out loud yet. How do you take power away from someone who's already left the room? For years, the world has been trained to believe that every royal decision involving Meghan had to be loud, reactive, emotional. Titles stripped, statements issued, sides taken, drama fed to the press like oxygen to a fire. But what if that expectation was the trap? What if the real power move was doing the exact opposite? This story isn't about punishment. It's about replacement. And that distinction changes everything. Picture a chessboard, not the fast kind. The slow, brutal kind where the game is decided long before anyone realizes they've lost. Kings don't rush. Kings wait. They let their opponents exhaust themselves. They let pieces overextend. And then, when the moment is right, they move once, and the game is effectively over. That's what this is. While the spotlight stayed locked on Los Angeles, on podcasts and appearances and rebrands and reinventions, something else was happening quietly across the Atlantic. No leaks. No briefings. Just trust being placed where it had always existed. And that trust belonged to someone no one was watching. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you saw Duchess Sophie in a scandal? When was the last time she needed defending? When was the last time she explained herself? Exactly. That's not an accident. That's design. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the chaos didn't start in Buckingham Palace. It started in Hollywood. In charity circles. In rooms where Meghan's name used to open doors automatically. Suddenly, calls weren't returned. Invitations stalled. Alignments shifted. Not dramatically. Subtly. The kind of subtle that makes you question your own relevance. Was it coincidence? Or was it coordination? The timing matters. The silence matters. And the choice of Sophie matters most of all. Because this wasn't about elevating her publicly. It was about transferring legitimacy quietly. About making one role permanent. And another optional. So ask yourself this. What hurts more, being attacked by the institution you left, or being replaced by it without a word? And here's the part that changes how you see everything that follows. Meghan didn't lose a title in public. She lost something far more valuable in private. And the moment Los Angeles finally understood what had happened, the fallout began. But what came next would make it clear this was never a reaction. It was a final move. The story continues. If you think this all started the moment Meghan left Britain, you're already behind the board. Here's the uncomfortable truth most commentators miss. The move that changed everything didn't happen when Meghan walked away. It happened when the palace stopped chasing her shadow. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed that the most confident player in the room is usually the quietest one? The one who doesn't argue, doesn't explain, doesn't rush to correct the record. That player already knows how the game ends. That's where this really begins. While headlines screamed about rebellion, freedom, and reinvention, the crown did something deeply counterintuitive. It slowed down. No retaliation. No visible counterattack. Just time. And time, in royal strategy, is not passive. It's a weapon. Think about it. Meghan's influence depended on reaction, on engagement, on being responded to. Every interview, every revelation, every carefully framed grievance relied on one thing: the institution pushing back. But what happens when the institution refuses to play that role? The noise keeps going, but the power starts draining out of it. This is where the chessboard matters. In chess, amateurs chase pieces. Masters watch space. King Charles didn't need to strike. He needed to wait until one side had no legal moves left without realizing it. And while attention stayed locked on California, something else unfolded quietly. Trust was being reinforced. Responsibilities were being recentered. Appearances were being reassigned. Not loudly, not symbolically, functionally. That's the key word. Function. Because here's a contradiction no one wants to admit. Titles don't matter until they do. They're invisible until the moment access depends on them. Until doors stop opening automatically. Until calls stop getting returned with the same urgency. You don't announce that shift. You let people feel it. And that's exactly what began to happen. Royal insiders didn't need memos. Charities didn't need instructions. International partners didn't need warnings. They watched where legitimacy flowed, who still had quiet authority, who still moved freely without explanation. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, attention drifted away from the loudest presence toward the most stable one. Ask yourself this. When chaos erupts, who do institutions trust more? The figure demanding acknowledgement, or the one who never asks for it? That question answered itself. And here's where the chess analogy sharpens. Meghan wasn't attacked. She wasn't cornered. She was allowed to keep moving, keep speaking, keep branding. That freedom felt like power. But in chess, a piece that keeps advancing without support is often being lured. Forward motion can be an illusion. Because while one side was busy expanding outward, the center was being secured by someone else entirely. Someone with no controversy, no appetite for spectacle, no need for validation. Someone the board already trusted. And that's when the first real shift happened. Not publicly, privately. When people stopped asking what Meghan would do next and started quietly aligning around someone who had never left in the first place. But the most dangerous part of this move wasn't the waiting. It was who had been standing ready all along. And once her role became visible, the game entered a new phase entirely. Because the moment Duchess Sophie stepped into that space, everything accelerated. And the fallout was no longer theoretical. The story deepens. Here's the question no one in the press room wanted to ask. Why her? Why Duchess Sophie? Not someone flashier. Not someone louder. Not someone with a ready-made media army. If this was about optics, there were easier choices. If this was about distraction, there were safer ones. So why did the quietest figure on the board suddenly become the most consequential? The answer is uncomfortable, and that's exactly why it works. Because power doesn't always look like power. Sometimes it looks like consistency. Sometimes it looks like showing up without needing applause. Sometimes it looks like a person who never had to announce loyalty because loyalty was assumed. King Charles III understood something that Hollywood rarely does. Attention is volatile, but trust compounds. And when institutions protect themselves, they don't bet on volatility. They consolidate around what won't explode. Think about Sophie's trajectory. No dramatic arcs. No personal branding experiments. No public grievances aired for leverage. Just years of being present, dependable, uncontroversial. The kind of presence that fades into the background until the background becomes the foundation. Ask yourself this. In a crisis, who do you put forward? The person who needs the spotlight to function, or the one who functions without it? That contrast matters more than any title ever could. And here's the contradiction that makes this move brilliant. On paper, Sophie doesn't compete with Meghan at all. Different lanes, different energies, different public appeal. But in practice, she does something far more threatening. She removes the need for comparison entirely. There's no rivalry when one side refuses to perform. That's the part many missed. This wasn't about crowning a replacement in the tabloid sense. It was about relocating legitimacy. Quietly, permanently, without triggering resistance. Duchess Sophie didn't need to take anything. The system simply leaned toward her because she had never leaned away from it. And when that happens, the shift feels organic. Inevitable, even. Like gravity doing its job. Meanwhile, across the ocean, something subtle but devastating began to take shape. The aura around Meghan's role started thinning. Not because she did something wrong in that moment, but because the reference point had changed. Meghan Markle had built influence on being the exception, the disruptor, the rule breaker. But disruption only works when there's something stable to push against. Once the system stops reacting, the disruptor starts floating. And floating looks a lot like freedom, until you realize there's nothing left to push off from. So while Sophie's rise felt invisible to the public, it was unmistakable to the people who matter. Diplomats, charities, institutions that don't chase headlines. They didn't need an announcement. They read the room, and the room had changed. But the most revealing moment didn't happen in Britain. It happened in Los Angeles. Because that's where the silence finally landed. And when it did, the reaction was immediate and far more chaotic than anyone expected. The story turned sharp here. Because Los Angeles didn't hear an announcement. It felt an absence. That's how this kind of power shift always arrives. Not with trumpets. With delays. With hesitations. With a sudden change in tone that no one can quite explain out loud. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room where you used to belong? and realized the room had moved on without telling you? That's what happened in LA. At first, it looked like nothing. A call that didn't get returned the same day. An invitation that came with conditions instead of enthusiasm. A meeting that got rescheduled and never quite found a new date. Small things. Easy to dismiss. Until they started stacking. This is where titles stop being symbolic and start becoming transactional. In Hollywood, status isn't about what you say you are. It's about what doors still open automatically. And suddenly, those doors were heavier. Charity boards hesitated. International partners paused. PR teams started asking questions they'd never asked before. Not accusatory questions. Practical ones. The kind that signal uncertainty. And uncertainty is deadly in influence-driven spaces. Here's the contradiction that stung the most. Meghan was louder than ever. More visible. More active. More present. And yet, the response was thinner. The engagement flatter. The momentum harder to sustain. It didn't make sense if you believed attention equaled power. But attention isn't power when legitimacy has quietly relocated. That's the part people miss. No one in LA needed a briefing from the palace. They didn't need to be told who mattered now. They watched patterns. They followed signals. They noticed who international institutions deferred to when things got delicate. And those signals were pointing elsewhere. Meanwhile, Sophie's presence wasn't loud in America. It didn't need to be. Her influence traveled institutionally, not culturally. Through trust channels. Through long-standing relationships. Through the kind of credibility that doesn't trend but endures. And that difference created chaos. Because Meghan's brand was built on relevance through disruption. But disruption only works when there's friction. When the system pushes back. When the spotlight amplifies the clash. When the crown refuses to engage, the clash evaporates. What do you do when there's no opponent left to fight? You keep talking. You keep moving. You keep producing content. And the room grows quieter anyway. That's when panic sets in. Not public panic. Strategic panic. The kind that leads to overcorrection. To louder moves. To sharper edges. To an energy shift that others feel before they can name it. And here's the most brutal part. By the time Meghan's camp fully realized what had happened, the decision wasn't reversible. There was no title to argue over. No announcement to contest. No statement to refute. The center of gravity had already moved. And when gravity shifts, everything else follows, whether it wants to or not. But just when it seemed like this was simply a slow fade, a final confirmation surfaced. One that made it clear this wasn't temporary. And once that confirmation became undeniable, the question stopped being, what now? It became what's left. The endgame begins here. Because once the confirmation settled in, not as news, not as scandal, but as reality, everything suddenly made sense in hindsight. This was never about humiliation. It was about permanence. Think about it. If the crown had wanted drama, it would have acted years ago. If it wanted punishment, it would have used language. If it wanted revenge, it would have fed the tabloids. None of that happened. Instead, what unfolded was far colder, far more strategic, and far more final. Legitimacy was quietly reassigned. And once legitimacy moves, it almost never moves back. Here's the emotional gut punch most people miss. Meghan didn't lose because she failed. She lost because the game changed while she was still playing the old one. She was fighting for relevance in a space that had already stopped being the center of power. She was winning attention while losing position. That's a brutal realization. Remember the opening question. How do you take power away from someone who already left the room? You don't chase them. You don't argue with them. You replace the role they thought only they could occupy. And you do it with someone who doesn't need to explain themselves. Duchess Sophie didn't arrive as a conqueror. She arrived as continuity, as reassurance, as proof that the institution could move forward without noise, without spectacle, without chaos. And that contrast did more damage than any public rebuke ever could. Ask yourself this. In 10 years, who will institutions remember? The figure who demanded attention? Or the one who quietly carried responsibility while the noise burned itself out? That's the real legacy question here. And it's why Los Angeles reacted the way it did. Not with outrage. With distance. With recalibration. With that unmistakable industry instinct that says, something has shifted, adjust accordingly. Because power hates instability. And it flees from it. This wasn't a checkmate delivered with flair. It was a bored position where one side suddenly realized there were no meaningful moves left. No leverage. No center. Just motion without consequence. That's why this move feels final. Not because Meghan can't keep speaking. She can. Not because she disappears. She won't. But because the role she once occupied no longer exists in the same way. And once a role is gone, fighting for it only makes the absence louder. So here's the lasting question I want you to sit with. Was this inevitable the moment Meghan chose visibility over institution? Or was it avoidable if the noise had stopped sooner? And more importantly, if this was the final chess move, what does the board look like next? Because when a king stops reacting and starts replacing, it usually means the game isn't getting louder. It's getting quieter. And silence, in this world, is never empty.